Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, let's get more on this global market route. We are joined by Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta. And Kriti, we saw a historic sell-off in Asia overnight.
We certainly did, and the sell-off is one of historic proportions. The Topix down 12%. The Nikkei also down another 12%. But it's not just Japan. You're also seeing the stock really spread off in the chip sector across Asia. Kospi, the Kosdaq, basically the South Korean indexes that have that major Samsung heavyweight, both down somewhere between 8 and 9%. You even have the Kosdaq in particular, which is, of course, the South Korean version of the Nasdaq, basically down a whopping 11%. That's just in the equity space, Nathan. You also have a similar story over in the currency space where dollar yen now at a 142 handle, really shaking things up in the FX space.
Yeah, we're seeing this sell-off spread into Europe where you are, though it doesn't look quite as bad there, Kriti.
It doesn't, but it is still red on the screen in line with the moves that you are seeing globally. Down a 2% decline in the Euro Stoxx 50. The FTSE 100 is your underperformer as well, down about 2.2%. Ironically, France isn't selling off as much. It's only down 1.8%. But the reason for that is simply that these markets aren't as deep as the ones in Asia. They're not as liquid as the ones in the States either.
All right, Kriti Gupta will be checking in with you all morning. Thank you. Treasuries do continue to rally this morning. Bets increasing. There will be an emergency Fed rate cut. In fact, traders now see a roughly 60% chance of an emergency quarter-point cut within 1 week. JP Morgan and Citigroup are revamping their forecast to predict a half-point cut in the U.S. in September. It all follows Friday's weaker-than-expected jobs report and beliefs that the Fed is too slow to support a slowing economy. Former Fed economist Claudia Sahm told Bloomberg Radio the data triggers her famous recession indicator, the Sahm rule.
Way too much momentum in the unemployment rate in recent months. 4.3%. So whether we are at that moment of a recession or not, this is your build into substantial weakening in the labor market.
Claudia Sahm with Sahm Consulting made the comments Friday on Bloomberg Surveillance right after the jobs report.
And Karen, as you mentioned, we're seeing Nasdaq futures plunge now nearly 4% this morning. Several big names are in the red. Let's get the latest from Bloomberg's Lisa Mateo. Lisa.
Good morning. Yeah, we're seeing the tech sell-off extending. We have NVIDIA down more than 8%. We have Microsoft, Meta plunging more than 4%. Alphabet down more than 4%. Amazon falling more than 2%. We even Tesla taking a hit down more than 5%. But this comes after the Nasdaq entered into that technical correction on Friday. And this was amid that drawback from the overheated artificial intelligence rally. Now, that gauge actually touched a record high less than a month ago. But it's not just AI. Investors are also concerned about elevated valuations and the impact of also the presidential election on geopolitical tensions. In New York, Lisa Mateo, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Lisa, thank you. Apple shares, they're down about 8%. Over the weekend, Berkshire Hathaway revealed it sold nearly half of its position in Apple during the second quarter. And we get more from Bloomberg's Doug Krisner.
The move could be interpreted as a lack of conviction in the Apple growth story. At the end of March, Berkshire's position was worth roughly $140 billion. Then, as of the end of June, it was worth $84 billion. Since 2016, when Berkshire first disclosed its stake, Apple shares have soared nearly 900%. Even with the sale, Apple does remain Berkshire's largest single position. If you're wondering about valuation, Apple's multiple is 33 times future profits. That's 11 points higher than the S&P 500. In New York, I'm Doug Krisner, Bloomberg Radio.
Thanks, Doug. Tech stocks aren't the only assets selling off this morning. We're also watching cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is down nearly 11%, adding to a 13.1% drop last week, the worst then since the period when the FTX exchange imploded. U.S. exchange-traded funds for Bitcoin suffered their largest outflows in about 3 months last Friday.
Well, Nathan, we'll have much more on the market sell-off in 5 minutes when we speak with RBC Capital Markets head of U.S. equity strategy, Lori Calvasina. But now we want to get the latest on the Middle East. Tensions there may be piling on to negative market sentiment. Israel is bracing for possible attacks from Iran and regional militias after the high-profile assassinations of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders last week. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his country is in a, quote, multi-front war against Iran's axis of of evil. But the White House is urging Netanyahu to redouble ceasefire negotiations with Hamas, even as the U.S. moves in a fighter jet squadron and keeps an aircraft carrier in the area. Here's Deputy National Security Advisor Jonathan Feiner.
What we're trying to do is prepare for any eventuality, any possibility. That's only responsible for the United States. Obviously, we've been quite clear that we will work with our ally Israel to defend itself against any threats that it faces, and we are in a moment that appears to be of heightened threat.
White House Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner made those comments on CBS's Face the Nation, heard Sundays on Bloomberg Radio.
And Karen, while the White House focuses on geopolitical tensions, Vice President Kamala Harris is reportedly focusing on the final stretch of choosing a running mate in her presidential campaign. We get that story from Bloomberg's Ed Baxter.
3 people on her short list met with her over the weekend: Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker also are names that are still being floated. Now, the Democratic Party is planning to virtually nominate a ticket by August 7th, and Harris has said that she plans to hit the campaign trail with her running mate tomorrow. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ed, thanks. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. For that, we're joined by Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Debbie strengthened into a hurricane as the system neared landfall in Florida's Big Bend region, where residents have fled ahead of a potential week-long disaster across the South. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn is tracking the storm.
Now, the very big concern with Debbie is as it moves inland over North Florida over the next day or so, the steering currents are going to collapse, and that means there's going to be nothing pushing the storm along. So it's just going to kind of meander over portions of southeastern Georgia, maybe eventually off the coast of southeastern South Carolina. This means some very heavy localized rains are going to fall over North Florida, eastern Georgia, and South Carolina through the first part of the work week.
Top winds intensified to 80 miles per hour, making Debbie a Category 1 system. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has revoked a plea agreement reached last week with the accused mastermind of the September 11 terror attacks and 2 alleged accomplices. That story this morning from Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
Secretary Austin has now assumed direct oversight of the case and canceled the plea agreement with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his alleged accomplices for the attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people in New York City, at the Pentagon, and in a Pennsylvania field. This effectively reinstates it as a death penalty case. Austin also relieved the senior Defense Department official responsible for oversight of this case. His decision brought relief to some family members of victims who had expressed anger over the deal, but it also left uncertain the next steps of the prosecution. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
And after 10 days in theaters, Deadpool and Wolverine is already the highest-grossing R-rated movie ever. In its second weekend, the Marvel Studios blockbuster starring Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman continued to steamroll through movie theaters, collecting $97 million, according to studio estimates. Global news 24 hours a day, and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker. This is Bloomberg. Nathan and Karen.
John, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The Yankees and Blue Jays rubber game at the stadium, and Juan Soto homered 7th inning. Yanks had their first lead. Toronto tied the game. Then there was a rain delay. And then there was a DJ LeMahieu walk-off hit in the 10th inning. Yanks won 4-3. They've won 7 of their last 8. Mets held the 5 hits, lost 3-2. They lost 2 of 3 to the Angels in Anaheim. The Chicago White Sox swept by the Twins. The White Sox have lost 20 games in a row. There have been only 2 longer losing streaks since 1900. The 61 Phillies dropped 23 straight. The 1988 Orioles began their season 0-21. The White Sox will try again tonight in Oakland. Noah Lyles won the 100 meters in Paris by 5 1/1000ths of a second. There's a belief that it was the closest race in Olympic history, not official because they didn't used to carry the times out that many decimal points, but Lyles can now be called the fastest man in the world. He's the first American to win the 100 meters in 20 years. Novak Djokovic can now be called an Olympic gold medal winner. He beat Carlos Alcaraz, and the 37-year-old winner of 24 Grand Slams was asked where this ranks.
2012 opening ceremony in London, carrying the flag for my country. The opening ceremony, opening the Olympic Games, is the best feeling that an athlete could have. Until today, this kind of supersedes everything that I imagined, that hoped that I could experience and that I could feel.
Scotty Scheffler won Olympic gold in golf with a furious finish, final round 62. Had Bobby Fink not won the 1,500 meters in the last individual event of the games, would have been the only time in Olympic history no U.S. golds in individual men's swimming. But Fink won. He broke the world record. The U.S. men did not win the medley relay. They had won each of the 15 previous ones they were in. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Karen, Nathan?
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. The global stock rout that began last week is intensifying this morning. Growing concerns about a weakening economy and a Fed that may have been too late to act to stop it. To get some perspective on this market reaction, we are joined now by Lori Calvasina, head of U.S. equity strategy at RBC Capital Markets. Lori, good morning. It is very tough to find some green on the screen this morning. Is it a pivot point for the market, or are investors overreacting?
Hi, Nathan. Well, thanks for having me. Look, I think there was a lot of confusion on Friday with the jobs report. I think we also had some negative data points from ISM last week. And to be honest, it really stands in contrast on both those reports with the tone we've been hearing from companies throughout this reporting season. So I think that there is a lot of sorting out to do right here. I do think that one of the reasons we've seen such a big reaction in markets has been sort of the sharp detour that we've seen. But I do think we need a little bit more information at this point.
As the sorting out period continues, Lori, we're seeing markets already pricing in something like 60% odds that the Fed's going to cut rates this week. I mean, how would stocks react if the Fed essentially makes up for last week's lost time?
So I think that we always have to ask about the reason that these sorts of things happen. And remember, this is market pricing. This is an official action. We did sort of look at this phenomenon last year during the regional banking crisis. And what we found was that really you have to be careful what you wish for, in this kind of regards. And I know there's been a lot of talk about, sort of 50 basis point cuts that have come out. We did actually publish something on that this morning, looking at when we've seen 50 basis point cuts in just recent decades, and it's tended to be associated with periods like the GFC, periods like COVID. At the moment, that doesn't seem to be the sort of environment that we are in. So, again, I think we need to wait and see what we're going to get from the Fed. But if you look at the history, the 50 basis point cuts, just in recent decades have been associated with sort of major periods of distress in markets. You can go back farther and look at the 90s and earlier to find other examples where that was not the case. But I do think that's the kind of playbook a lot of investors have in their heads.
So while we wait for the Fed and while we wait for further data, do you see this route going further, or could this be a buy opportunity?
So I think we're going to have to watch the data this week that comes in. But what I will tell you is that we came into the third quarter thinking that we were at risk of a pullback. Now, we did not have sudden concerns about a recession on our bingo card. But the reality is that if you looked at the CFTC data and we looked at U.S. equity futures positioning, this is something we track every week. If you look at where we've been throughout most of this year, frankly, it's been on U.S. equity future positioning broadly and S&P 500 future positioning in particular above the January 2018 highs and above the February 2020 highs. And so we had, obviously a tough year in 2018, but we did have, sort of a milder drawdown on the low vol unwind early that year. 2020, obviously, we all know what happened there. But from a positioning perspective, whether you're looking S&P, Nasdaq futures positioning as well, has looked extremely extended, and we have looked vulnerable to bad news from that perspective.
I think it was just maybe the last time or two we spoke, you had cautiously raised your S&P 500 price target for the end of this year. Now that we've seen this pretty significant dive this morning and the potential for more, are you rethinking that?
So what we had baked into our outlook was the idea that we would see a 5 to 10% type drawdown, and that's a garden variety type drawdown. But if you go beyond 10%, what the history tends to tell us is that it's associated with a pretty intense growth scare. So obviously those risks have risen in here. We don't know that it's certain we're going to get that 10 to 20% drawdown. But if you look at those periods, especially in recent history, we've seen those kinds of drawdowns, 15% back in 2010, 20% in 2011. Obviously, if you go back to the 2015-2016 growth scare, I think we fell about 14%. So those are the kinds of periods. We have not baked in that kind of scenario into our modeling as of now.
About 30 seconds left, Lori. What's it going to take to bring confidence back into this market?
So I think let's watch the sentiment and positioning indicators. Remember, AAII has also looked stretched when we get down to the 1 standard deviation mark below the long-term average. That has typically, in recent years given us a buy signal. Also watch valuations. They've been very extended for the broad market. They've been very extended for the top 10 mega cap names. Let's watch what happens when those numbers get back down to average. We can often see markets try to make a stand around those kinds of levels in these sorts of environments.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.